Night had already fallen over Buganda when the drums began. Heavy, slow, ritualistic, a sound that echoed through the hills like a warning. Inside the royal enclosure of Mengo, torches flickered against the reed walls, and the shadows of armed guards moved silently around the palace. On the throne, wrapped in leopard skins, sat Mwanga II, barely 17 years old, but already feared by an entire kingdom. His eyes held a strange mixture of youth and dread. He had inherited a kingdom surrounded by enemies, foreign missionaries, Arab traders, rival chiefs, and the ghosts of his own bloodline. Each one wanted something from him. Each one threatened the fragile authority of a king still learning how to command his own fears. And behind those fears, something darker was growing. Whispers would soon accuse him of monstrous acts, burning pages alive, torturing enemies, consuming the flesh of those he believed had cursed him. Europe would remember him as a cannibal king, a symbol of savagery used to justify colonization. But monsters are never born, they are made. And on this night, with the drums echoing through the darkness and the young king staring into the fire, as if something inside it terrified him, the transformation had already begun. This is the story of Mwanga II, a kingdom collapsing, a ruler unraveling, and a descent into terror fueled by fear, betrayal, and the shadow of empire.
The kingdom of Buganda had always been a place of power, ritual, and danger. It sat wrapped around the northern shores of Lake Victoria, a land of lush hills, towering banana groves, and ancient clan traditions that shaped every breath its people took. But beneath the beauty, Buganda hid a secret truth. Its throne was the most dangerous seat in Africa. Kings did not simply rule. They survived, and if they were lucky. And Mwanga, born in 1868, grew up inside a palace where everyone smiled and everyone plotted. A child in a palace of shadows. From the moment he could walk, Mwanga was surrounded by rituals he barely understood. Servants bowed, advisors whispered. Clan leaders watched him carefully, as if trying to determine what kind of king he would become. His father, Mutisa I, was a powerful and unpredictable ruler. Brilliant, manipulative, feared. Some nights he told stories to young Mwanga, laughing loudly. Other nights he executed men in the courtyard, to remind the kingdom who held the power of life and death. Mwanga learned early. Trust was dangerous, fear was useful, and kingship was a cage made of gold. Even as a child, he sensed the poison in the air. Missionaries arrived, white men with strange clothes, strange books, and strange promises about a distant god. Some brought knowledge, some brought guns. All brought an agenda. Arab traders came too, speaking of profit and trade, offering gifts and alliances, while quietly expanding their control. Clans maneuvered behind the throne. Brothers killed brothers. All believed they were the ones destined to shape Buganda's future. And little Mwanga, surrounded by forces far larger than himself, watched everything in silence, because he understood what no child should ever have to understand. One day, all of this danger would be his to control. The day the drums fell silent. When Mwanga was 13, the royal drums, the sacred drums that signaled the life of the king, suddenly fell silent. The palace stopped breathing. Messengers ran through the courtyards. The women of the harem began to wail. King Mutesa I was dead. For a moment, Buganda held its breath. No one knew what would happen. No one knew who would rise next. Assassination, civil war, clan rebellion, they all were possible. But the chiefs had already chosen. Mwanga, barely a teenager, would be king. The drummers began again, beating the rhythm of coronation instead of mourning. Torches were lit. The royal court surged into motion. And Mwanga, who only yesterday had been a child watching the world from behind beaded curtains, now stepped forward through the palace gates wearing the mantle of Kabaka, king of Buganda. He did not understand the full weight of what was coming. No king ever did. But he could feel eyes on him, hundreds of eyes, sharp and hungry. Some saw a puppet, some saw a threat. Some saw an opportunity. And somewhere in that crowd, someone whispered the prophecy that chilled the royal pages. A child king is a feast for wolves. A young king surrounded by danger. Mwanga's first weeks on the throne were a storm of protocols, rituals, and sudden demands. The clans wanted favors. The missionaries wanted influence. The Arab traders wanted trade rights. The chiefs wanted control. Everyone wanted something. And Mwanga, only 17 when he began to fully rule, realized something terrifying. The throne did not give him power. It exposed his weakness. Everywhere he turned, someone challenged him. Missionaries openly taught young pages loyalty to a foreign faith, a loyalty that in Buganda's political system meant disloyalty to the Kabaka. Arab traders whispered that he should embrace Islam, while secretly smuggling weapons to their allies. British envoys arrived wearing polished boots and false politeness, their eyes fixed on Buganda like hunters studying prey. Even inside the palace, Mwanga felt trapped. His pages, young men trained to serve the king, were no longer simply servants. Some were spies, some were converts, some were political weapons. He could not even trust the people who poured his drink or lit his fire. So the young king began to retreat into himself, into suspicion, into rituals meant to assert his authority. And for the first time the darkness whispered to him, "If they fear you, they cannot betray you." It was a seed, just a seed, planted deeply into his mind. But it would grow, and it would devour him. The seeds of cruelty power does not corrupt all at once. It begins as a tremor, a flicker, a whisper in the back of the mind. For Mwanga II, the whisper began the moment he realized that the throne he had inherited was not made of strength, but of fractures. Every direction he turned, something pushed against him, challenged him, threatened him. And a king who is cornered learns quickly that fear can be a weapon, a shield, a refuge. This chapter is the story of how fear, fed by politics, religion, and betrayal, slowly twisted a young ruler into something darker. The foreigners who divided a kingdom. The first seeds were planted not by Mwanga himself, but by the strangers who had swarmed Buganda during his father's reign. Catholic missionaries, Protestant missionaries, Arab traders, European explorers. Each group claimed they came to civilize, to teach, to guide. But each wanted something: convert the kingdom, control the king, shape Buganda's future in their image. They trained young pages, the very boys who served the king, to read, to write, and to doubt every belief that had kept Buganda stable for centuries. And the dangerous part, these pages adored them. They listened, they believed, they changed. This terrified Mwanga, because in Buganda, pages were the king's inner circle, his eyes and ears, the ones entrusted with his secrets and safety. Now many of them prayed to foreign gods, pledged loyalty to foreign teachers, and spoke about faith and morality in ways that directly undermined their king. Mwanga felt them slipping away, not just as servants, but as sons of Buganda. A palace that no longer felt like his own. The palace at Mengo was supposed to be the safest place in the world for a Kabaka. But as Mwanga walked its halls, he saw things that troubled him deeply. A page refusing an order because of his new Christian teaching. Another bowing without touching the ground, a sign of disrespect. Groups whispering prayers at night. Young men who believed they answered to a higher authority than their king. He felt watched, judged, rejected. This stung him more than anything else, because Mwanga, for all his royal power, was still a teenager longing for loyalty, validation, and affection. And now the very people meant to serve him turned away from him in the name of religion. His loneliness began to ferment into anger. Now the ghost of his father, Mutesawai, haunted Mwanga. Not literally, but politically. Every chief, every clan leader, every elder compared the young king to the man who had ruled before him. And in those comparisons, Mwanga heard only accusation. You are weaker than your father. You cannot control the missionaries like he did. You cannot command the loyalty he commanded. You are not him. But the cruelest whisper came from inside Mwanga himself, a whisper that sounded like his father's voice. Show them strength. Show them fear. Give me the first act of desperation. One night, Mwanga called for a trusted page, a boy named Senkole. He had served the king since childhood. They had grown up together, spoken at night, shared secrets. But Senkole had converted to Christianity. He refused one of Mwanga's commands, a command meant to test loyalty, not morality. And in that refusal, Mwanga saw something terrifying. The king of Buganda no longer commanded obedience in his own palace. The fear inside him snapped. He ordered Senkole killed, not slowly, not ceremonially, violently. And as the boy's screams echoed through the palace halls, Mwanga trembled. Not with pleasure, not with triumph, but with a new kind of certainty. This is what power feels like. This is how kings survive. It was the first time the darkness inside him stepped forward. But it would not be the last. All the missionaries fight back. Instead of cowering, the Christians did something Mwanga never expected. They resisted. Pages refused royal orders. Teachers wrote letters condemning the king. Foreigners began calling Mwanga cruel, mad, immoral, and British officials, who had been waiting for an excuse, began to intervene, offering protection and guidance. Mwanga now saw threats everywhere. Every page who knelt before a missionary was a traitor. Every convert was a potential assassin. Every refusal was an act of rebellion. The paranoia grew, and with it the cruelty. The breaking of a young mind sleep left him. Appetite abandoned him. He walked the palace at night, pacing like a hunted animal, imagining plots behind every curtain. Some nights he drank too much. Other nights he muttered to himself, rehearsing the punishments he would give to those who dared defy him. Fear had become his constant companion, and fear, when mixed with power, creates monsters. Mwanga was not yet the tyrant history would remember. Not yet the man who would order the burning of Christian pages. Not yet the king whose name would be tied to cannibalism, torture, and terror. But the seeds were there, rooted, watered, growing. The boy king was disappearing, and in his place something darker was taking shape. The Palace of Fire. By the time Mwanga reached his late teens, the palace at Mengo no longer felt like a royal court. It felt like a battlefield. Every corridor held an enemy. Every whisper carried a threat. Every prayer, spoken softly by young converts before they slept, felt like a dagger aimed at his throne. And Mwanga, already fraying at the edges, reached a breaking point. This is the chapter where fear ignites into violence, where the king's paranoia becomes policy, where the palace of Buganda becomes a place of smoke, screams, and fire, the storm behind the walls. The missionaries had not come to Buganda alone. They brought ideas that were poison to Mwanga's fragile rule. Christianity taught loyalty to a higher authority, refusal to obey immoral orders, resistance to kings who acted unjustly to Mwanga. This wasn't religion. It was treason. Worse still, the very pages closest to him, those who tended the royal fires, guarded his chambers, and heard his private fears, were embracing the new faith. Some refused alcohol. Some refused royal intimacy. Many refused ritual obligations, and one by one their refusals struck Mwanga like blows across the face, because each one said the same thing quietly, defiantly, without raising a weapon. I do not fear you. No king in Buganda's history had been challenged like this by children. And Mwanga, with the weight of the kingdom crushing his shoulders, began to see them less as boys and more as enemies. Reader, the assassination that changed everything. The final spark came from far away, but its flames reached the palace. A British explorer, Bishop James Hannington, was traveling toward Buganda from the east. He claimed he came in peace to preach, to teach, to bring the light of God. But for Mwanga, the threat was unmistakable. Foreigners pretended to bring religion, but they always brought conquest. When word reached him that Hannington approached along a path considered sacred and forbidden, Mwanga panicked. He saw it as an invasion route, a prelude to British domination. And so he did something that would echo across history. He ordered Hannington killed. The bishop was ambushed, speared, and left for dead in the forest. His last words, according to witnesses, were calm, resigned, almost prophetic. But in Europe, the reaction was outrage, shock, fury. Mwanga had stepped on the tail of an empire. The British had their excuse. And the king's fear becomes fury. After the bishop's death, Mwanga waited for the storm. He expected armies, guns, ships arriving on the shores of Lake Victoria. But what came instead was far worse. Defiance from inside the palace. Pages who refused to abandon Christianity. Young men who insisted that faith came before loyalty to the throne. Teachers who encouraged resistance. The challenge became unbearable. If Mwanga could not command obedience from boys living under his roof, how could he ever hope to stand against the empire moving like a shadow toward Buganda? His fear hardened, turned sharp, turned cruel, and one night, it finally broke. Burn them. It began with a simple question spoken in a trembling voice. Will you obey your king? Some pages nodded. Most hesitated. A few stood silent, eyes lowered, lips moving in quiet prayer. Mwanga felt something inside him snap. In that moment, he believed the pages were not just betraying him. They were betraying Buganda, the throne, the ancestors, the land itself. He could not bend them. He could not frighten them, so he decided he would destroy them. He gathered the royal executioners, the kiboko whips, the ropes, the torches, and he gave the order that would define his reign forever. Burn them. The martyrs of Buganda. They were taken from the palace, young men, some barely older than Mwanga himself. Christians, Catholics, and Protestants alike, boys who believed their faith was worth dying for. They were marched to Namugongo, a place already stained with the blood of past executions. There huge wooden pyres were built. Some of the pages trembled, some prayed, some sang hymns through their tears. Not one renounced his faith. As the fires were lit, smoke curled into the sky. The king's guard stepped back from the heat. The boys cried out, not just from pain, but from conviction. Witnesses said their voices echoed across the hills. And Mwanga, sitting in the palace, waited, listened, tried to convince himself this would restore his power, his control, his authority. But instead something else happened. The fires lit a spark, not of terror but of rebellion. Europe now had martyrs, missionaries had heroes. The British had justification. Mwanga had made an example. But he had also made a mistake, a terrible one. After the flames days later, the ashes cooled. The bodies were gone, but the impact remained. Those who survived spread the story. Churches in Europe preached about the monstrous king of Buganda. British officials drafted plans in secret. Missionaries wrote letters demanding intervention. Mwanga had tried to destroy a threat, instead he fed it. The Cannibal King. By the time the fires of Namugongo stopped crackling, Mwanga II was no longer just a king fighting rebels or defiant pages. He was becoming something else, a myth, a warning, a monster whispered about by missionaries in the dark, by traders at night markets, by children who dared one another to walk near the palace walls. A monster with a crown, but like all monsters, Mwanga was born not from darkness but from fear. This is the chapter where fear becomes hunger, where desperation becomes cruelty, where the line between truth and legend blurs beyond recognition, and where Mwanga earns the nickname whispered by Europeans, the Cannibal King, a name that would follow him to his death. The king who could not sleep. After ordering the burning of the Christian pages, Mwanga expected peace, obedience, silence, control. But what he got instead was the opposite. The palace felt haunted, not by spirits but by memories. He heard footsteps behind him even when he walked alone. He saw smoke rising from corners that were perfectly clean. He woke at night convinced someone was standing at the foot of his bed. He ate alone but swore hands reached for his plate. He bathed alone but felt fingers grip his ankles beneath the water. Servants whispered that the king no longer slept, that he prowled the palace at night like a restless lion, that he muttered to himself, repeating the same words over and over, "They are coming for me." The British, the Christians, his own people, his own pages, everyone. Mwanga was no longer a ruler. He was a frightened boy trapped inside a collapsing kingdom. And frightened boys do reckless things. It's the Palace of Shadows. The inner chambers of Mengo Palace changed in those days. Doors were locked, windows barred, drums posted outside every hallway, ready to sound an alarm at the slightest threat. But it was inside the royal court that the transformation became most terrifying. The king became obsessed with testing loyalty. Every day he questioned his officials. Every night he interrogated servants. He demanded impossible displays of obedience. Some men were ordered to stay awake for days. Others were forced to kneel until their legs went numb. Some were commanded to strike friends or relatives to prove their loyalty. And always, someone was watching. Mwanga wanted to know who feared him, who hated him, and who would betray him. But the more he forced obedience, the more loyalty turned to resentment, and resentment to fear. And from that fear came the stories. Stories twisted, stories embellished, stories born from whispers in the dark. Stories that would turn Mwanga into something worse than a tyrant. The first rumor of flesh. There was a servant in the palace named Cato, a timid, quiet man who had survived Mwanga's purges simply by being invisible. One night, Cato vanished. One morning later, the king appeared at court in a strangely calm mood, the calm of a man who had eaten well after months of restlessness. People noticed, people whispered, and a rumor spread through the palace. Cato had been taken in the night, taken to the king and eaten. Was it true? Almost certainly not. But the palace was drowning in fear, and fear breeds legends the way corpses breed flies. So when a second servant disappeared, followed by a third, the whispers grew louder. The king eats those who displease him. It wasn't the Christians who invented this tale. It started right there, inside Mwanga's own home. But missionaries would soon seize it, exaggerate it, weaponize it, because Europe loves nothing more than a savage king in need of civilization. And Mwanga, stumbling, paranoid, and surrounded by enemies, played right into their hands. The Cannibal King. By the time the fires of Namugongo stopped crackling, Mwanga II was no longer just a king fighting rebels or defiant pages. He was becoming something else, a myth, a warning, a monster whispered about by missionaries in the dark, by traders at night markets, by children who dared one another to walk near the palace walls. A monster with a crown, but like all monsters, Mwanga was born not from darkness but from fear. This is the chapter where fear becomes hunger, where desperation becomes cruelty, where the line between truth and legend blurs beyond recognition, and where Mwanga earns the nickname whispered by Europeans, the Cannibal King, a name that would follow him to his death. The king who could not sleep. After ordering the burning of the Christian pages, Mwanga expected peace, obedience, silence, control. But what he got instead was the opposite. The palace felt haunted, not by spirits but by memories. He heard footsteps behind him even when he walked alone. He saw smoke rising from corners that were perfectly clean. He woke at night convinced someone was standing at the foot of his bed. He ate alone but swore hands reached for his plate. He bathed alone but felt fingers grip his ankles beneath the water. Servants whispered that the king no longer slept, that he prowled the palace at night like a restless lion, that he muttered to himself, repeating the same words over and over, "They are coming for me." The British, the Christians, his own people, his own pages, everyone. Mwanga was no longer a ruler. He was a frightened boy trapped inside a collapsing kingdom. And frightened boys do reckless things. It's the Palace of Shadows. The inner chambers of Mengo Palace changed in those days. Doors were locked, windows barred, drums posted outside every hallway, ready to sound an alarm at the slightest threat. But it was inside the royal court that the transformation became most terrifying. The king became obsessed with testing loyalty. Every day he questioned his officials. Every night he interrogated servants. He demanded impossible displays of obedience. Some men were ordered to stay awake for days. Others were forced to kneel until their legs went numb. Some were commanded to strike friends or relatives to prove their loyalty. And always, someone was watching. Mwanga wanted to know who feared him, who hated him, and who would betray him. But the more he forced obedience, the more loyalty turned to resentment, and resentment to fear. And from that fear came the stories. Stories twisted, stories embellished, stories born from whispers in the dark. Stories that would turn Mwanga into something worse than a tyrant. The first rumor of flesh. There was a servant in the palace named Kato, a timid, quiet man who had survived Mwanga's purges simply by being invisible. One night, Kato vanished. One morning later, the king appeared at court in a strangely calm mood, the calm of a man who had eaten well after months of restlessness. People noticed, people whispered, and a rumor spread through the palace. Kato had been taken in the night, taken to the king and eaten. Was it true? Almost certainly not. But the palace was drowning in fear, and fear breeds legends the way corpses breed flies. So when a second servant disappeared, followed by a third, the whispers grew louder. The king eats those who displease him. It wasn't the Christians who invented this tale. It started right there, inside Mwanga's own home. But missionaries would soon seize it, exaggerate it, weaponize it, because Europe loves nothing more than a savage king in need of civilization. And Mwanga, stumbling, paranoid, and surrounded by enemies, played right into their hands.
Missionary letters. The birth of a monster. Months after the fires of Namugongo, European missionaries sent letters back home. Messages filled with fear, shock, and a sense that something dark was unfolding. They spoke of a king losing his grip on reality, punishments delivered without warning, bodies found in disturbing states, unexplained disappearances, unnatural behaviors. And the most explosive accusation, Mwanga consumed parts of his victims to gain power. But was it true? History says no. The stories were twisted, exaggerated by terrified witnesses, and amplified by Europeans who wanted a moral reason to intervene. But in Buganda, truth mattered less than emotion. Fear became fact. Whispers hardened into belief. The palace became a place avoided after sunset, and Mwanga, isolated, paranoid, shaken, began to adopt the identity others forced upon him. If they insisted he was a monster, he would rule like one. Desperation at the throne. During the following year, Mwanga issued punishments that grew increasingly dramatic, symbolic, and rooted in superstition. Some offenders were locked in underground chambers. Others were paraded publicly to intimidate rivals. A few were executed with ceremony whenever Mwanga felt the British were judging him. He believed fear could keep his kingdom intact. But fear does not unite, it fractures. The chiefs conspired. The Christians murmured in secret. The British waited, and Mwanga, wandering the palace corridors with a distant, fevered stare, convinced himself he could still triumph. He believed the ancestors would defend him, that the spirits of Buganda supported him, that his escalating brutality was not madness, but fate. The Ugandan nightmare. The legend of Mwanga's cannibalism spread like wildfire. Missionaries preached it. Explorers documented it. Traders repeated it. Chiefs whispered it. Children feared it. Mwanga, cornered, overwhelmed, desperate, did nothing to stop the rumors. The kingdom slipped into nightmare. Every missing person became proof. Every strange odor sparked suspicion. Every gesture of the king became a threat. It didn't matter that the accusation was false. It felt true, and that was enough. To the beginning of the end. When the British finally launched military intervention, they didn't label Mwanga a tyrant. They didn't call him a despot. They didn't even call him an enemy of the crown. They called him something far more damning. A barbaric ruler dangerous to his own people. That was the story they needed. That was the justification for conquest. That was the narrative that turned invasion into moral duty. And so the troops advanced. Weapons were raised. The empire closed in. Mwanga, surrounded by rivals, haunted by the consequences of his actions, trapped in a kingdom crumbling under its own fear, prepared for the final confrontation. But he did not yet understand. His greatest enemy was not the British. It was the terrifying image he had allowed himself to become.
The king devoured by his own legend. In the end, history did not need to kill Mwanga II. He was already eaten alive. Not by enemies, not by rebels, not by the British Empire, but by the very stories whispered about him. The Cannibal King, the monster of Buganda, the boy who feared his own shadow. These titles clung to him more tightly than any crown. For years, Mwanga tried to command obedience through terror, but the more he tightened his grip, the more his kingdom slipped through his fingers. Every execution bred a rumor. Every disappearance created a myth. Every night he spent pacing in paranoia only fed the monster people believed him to be. In the heart of Buganda, people no longer feared merely the king. They feared what he symbolized, a nation devouring itself under the pressure of change, faith, and empire. And in that chaos, truth became irrelevant. Whether Mwanga ever truly consumed human flesh no longer mattered. The rumor alone was enough. Missionaries wrote it, Europe repeated it. The empire weaponized it. And Mwanga believed, too late, that he could fight an army of lies with a handful of frightened warriors. He could not. So the king fled. He hid, he returned. He begged, he threatened. He surrendered, he resisted again. But nothing he did could erase the legend. Because legends don't need facts, they need fear. And fear was the only thing Mwanga had left. By the time he died in exile, far from the palace, far from Buganda, far from the drums and chants of his kingdom, he was no longer a ruler. He was a story. A dark, twisted, impossible story. A story of a king who loved power, feared shadows, and fought ghosts. A story of a kingdom torn between tradition and change. A story of missionaries, rebels, chiefs, and whispers that spread faster than fire. A story Europeans would use to justify conquest. A story his own people would tell in hushed voices. A story that swallowed its own creator. Mwanga II did not become the monster described by his enemies. He became something worse, a warning of what happens when fear rules a throne. A king eaten not by men but by myth. And that is how history remembers him. The cannibal king who may never have tasted flesh, but was forever consumed by the darkness he unleashed.